Look, at this point, Gundam is a series with a lot of history behind it. 44 years to be exact, for those of you who are wondering. This is a series that is likelier to be older than most of us out here, and if it isn't actually older than you, well done on being able to access this video. I commend your ability to integrate with technology. And with a series that has lasted for this long, you would think that it would start to act with a certain level of decorum to it, right? You would think that like many of the other wonderful and old series out there that we all know and that are still popular today, it is a series that would take its position seriously. It will consider the IPs that it chooses to collab with a lot more, and it will be a lot more selective in the type of games that it will release, for it has a huge brand image that it really has to. Okay, look, we're just talking about the Gundam Overwatch game today, alright? And of course, at this point, I can hear some of you asking through your telekinetic powers, but wait a minute, Mr. Salaryman, a Gundam Overwatch game? What are you talking about? Could it be that your brain has finally started to turn to mush from all of the pokey you have been smoking? First up, this is a completely legitimate and harmless hobby, so I'll have none of that spite, thank you very much. And more importantly, even if you don't know about that game, I guess it's fine at this point. For while it was a game that was very successful in the first month of its launch, we're talking about a game whose simultaneous user base on Steam dropped from 16k on launch to 600 within the span of 6 months, so a game that died out very quickly in terms of the public eye. Okay, look, I know that I'm more than a month late to join the show that you're distraught that this game is ending service or talk about how you knew that it was gonna happen definitely party, but the reason for this is because I wanted to do a bit more research into the situation at hand, because the fact that this game ended service as quickly as it did and on such a note made it feel really weird. And as someone who has the good luck to be able to work in Japan and in the game industry no less, I decided to reach out to a few contacts I have, as well as to do quite a bit of my own digging as well to try and see if I could glean more information about this situation. So Gundam Evolutions, or as it is sometimes lovingly known as Gundam Overwatch, which was released by Bandai Namco back in September of 2022, according to the very pretentious genre that they gave it, it was called a Gundam team shooter game, which basically just meant that they were making a game that was like Overwatch except with Gundams in it. That said, especially during the first month after its release, this game was actually rather positively received by the community at large, with many people actually deciding to make the jump over from Overwatch to this game as well. That might have been in part due to the fact that Overwatch 2 had just released at the time, and that dumpster fire was probably pissing people off enough for them to decide to make this jump to this game that had just released as well. But overall, during that period of time, there were also some YouTubers who were saying how they felt like this was a better game than Overwatch was at that time, and there was some level of hype around it. But what then caused this title that had so much going for it, with the exodus of players from Overwatch as well, to then crash and burn within less than a year from its initial release? Because in case you didn't know, the game has already announced the end of all services and the stoppage of all of its in-game monetary transactions. And today, I would like to take a more in-depth look with you guys at this situation as someone who has worked in this industry for a few years and who has managed to reach out to some people who has worked on this project as well. In spite of all of that, looking at the history of the game's design, I can't help but feel like this game was at the very least set out to not be something that would do very well. Well, you see, there were many issues that started up even before the game's release. The fact that the game actually took 6 years to develop isn't something that is mentioned as much online, especially in the English-speaking community. In fact, even in Japan, the very first major publication talking about the game kind of was in a teaser in the middle of 2019, where some people were talking about the fact that they would potentially be brought on to deal with a PvP online Gundam game, and that was already 3 years back. But obviously the game had to have been going on for the initial prototyping for way longer, and if you knew people who knew about what was going on, you could more or less figure out that it took about 6 years. I mean, there are also Japanese YouTubers who have made reference to this, although they too have not pointed out exactly where their sources. I get the feeling it's because their sources are probably also people within the company who don't want their asses to get fired. But at the very least, even if you don't trust us, you can trust the fact that from this article at least, the game definitely did take more than 3 years to develop, so similar at minimum to Overwatch, or slightly more if you consider the fact that the game probably needed prototyping before people were brought on to deal with it. To attempt to explain why this was so worrying to me, let me try to put it into perspective. Gundam Evolutions, in spite of the fact that it was a game that's using another game's core mechanics as its base, essentially the developers looked at Overwatch and decided we want to make something like that, except we refine some of the gameplay systems so that it plays differently while mostly being the same. It took them 6 years to develop their game, where Overwatch only really took 3 years. By Japanese standards, they are a rather big game company which has developed many titles in the past, ranging from third-person shooters to action RPGs, as well as just action games outright. They are a company that has made games that are pretty popular as well. Well, I mean, not all their games are popular, some just end up pretty bad, but for the most part, they make good games. And yet the amount of time it took them to develop this game, which was similar to Overwatch, was about as long as it took for the development of Baldur's Gate 3 in its entirety, so yeah, the fact that my Gundams can't bang in that game is a little disappointing, not gonna lie. Now, of course, there some of you might say, but wait a minute, Overwatch was initially designed using the leftover assets from another failed project, and that failed project kinda did give them a head start, so 3 years to develop the entirety of Overwatch. It's a short time because of the fact they had the previous failure. And to be fair, you might be kinda right there, but you know, it's not like Bandai Namco has had years of experience developing Gundam PvP games which they have been holding yearly tournaments for or something like that. Huh? Maxi boost? Pfft. Please, the only maxi getting boosted here is you big scrub. The developer of Gundam Evolutions, Maruyama Kazuya, has only really developed 2 titles prior to this, and the 2 titles that he has developed are Gundam Online in its early years, as well as Gundam Taisen, which isn't really as popular outside of Japan, which both of these were titles as well that they weren't the best, especially at the start. With Gundams Online, it kinda did last for quite a while, I think for quite a few years before it finally ended service, but even during the time that it was in operation, the time during which he was the producer of the game, which was his initial few years, was some of the most tumultuous years of the game's entire history. In fact, it actually became a normal calling meme thing. I don't know what's the best ways to use for it, but like whenever something went wrong with the game, which was apparently very common, the first thing people would be doing on message boards would be screaming his name to the high heavens, cursing his entire family lineage for letting the game bug once again. In fact, the game was so close to being known as a Kusoge within its first few years, which doesn't bode well for the type of person who was going to be dealing with this title. Then the second game he worked on, Gundam Network Taisen, it's basically, if you have played early Evany or something like one of those games, it's basically just that you build city, you fight people, it's nothing new or unique. And this was the only 2 titles he had made prior to Gundam Evolutions. Granted, you could say that he has a lot of experience with Gundam itself, but in terms of his skill as a producer, I wouldn't say he is the best. The only successful competitive Gundam game series that the company owns is not even something he was involved in, so not the best outlook over there. And on top of the fact that you had a producer that was like this is also the fact that the team was largely stocked with pro gamers as your game designers and programmers. So yeah, here's the thing, right? I'm not trying to say that you can't be a professional gamer and a good game designer at the same time. Obviously, that is something that can happen. The thing I'm trying to say here is more the fact that them stocking the entire team with people with no game design experience who just happen to be professional gamers isn't a very clever decision to make either. There's an old saying, and it doesn't just apply to games, but just most forms of art in general, which is that your first work will be crap. And this is true in gaming as well. It doesn't matter what your field is. As you produce multiple works and refine your craft, you tend to get a better understanding of what works, what doesn't, what can be innovative, but also practical. And it is through this process of learning that one gets better at doing what they're doing. Like, I have no doubt that if I gave these professional gamers 20 weapons in their game, they will be able to tell me what is the most meta weapon, what would work best, in what situation and all that. However, at the same time, I wouldn't bank on them being able to, if given a game that they have never touched in their life, that is just in a similar genre, to be able to then balance what the stats of all of these 30 weapons should be, how much damage it should have, how much spread, what its range should be effectively. And the same can be said for level design, right? With a game like Gundam Evolutions, where the producer says that he wants to create a situation where every unit can be more or less used in every map, you need good designers who are able to come up with a good arena design, one where every character can be used at its effective range to the best effect, which I would trust someone who has had 10 years of experience working on something like this, maybe someone who has worked on Gundam Extreme in the past, to design, rather than giving to someone who has played Overwatch before and therefore they just assume would be very good at designing Overwatch maps as well. And this was being pushed as a very big marketing thing. Like, during interviews with the team about the game's design, the thing that seemed to be brought up the most was the fact that these two people who were leading the design were pro gamers who had played PUBG, Overwatch, and like they were also talking about how, oh, we've got a team full of professional gamers here. We know what's best for the game. We've all played games before, so we can kind of tell this doesn't work or that works, which, yeah, I guess they can identify the problems. I have no doubt they would. But whether these are the type of people I would trust to fix the problems they have then identified to create a unique game experience, I would push X very hard. So hard, in fact, that my button would probably fall off from my keyboard. And so I hope that this kind of gives you guys a good understanding of why I was kind of worried about whether or not this game would succeed even from its initial design phase, due to the fact that you kind of had a producer who didn't really have a good track record of designing good games. You had a team of designers of the game who weren't exactly very skilled or experienced at designing or making games and were being put on a pedestal in this design situation. And on top of that, this game, it took 6 years to design, which granted in the first few years before most of these people were brought on, it was probably being prototyped by a much smaller team, so cost was low. But the fact that overall this game took as long as it did to make probably means that they were actually running very into the red even before we knew that the game even existed as a whole. And so it would mean that the game, if it did not succeed really quickly, it probably was going to crash and burn, because it'll be harder and harder from then on for them to make back all of the money that had already lost in the designing of this game. Then there's also the issue of where this game was being released on launch, because in spite of the fact that it seemed like they're trying to turn this into a global phenomenon on release, this game was less global than certain tyrannical dictatorships out there. For reference, here are some of the regions as well as some countries in which this game just was not released on launch. So the entirety of Latin America, so every country from Mexico down, every country east of Germany within Europe, the entirety of the Middle East, the entirety of Africa, India, China, as well as Australia for some reason. I don't know, maybe they just lived too far off in the inverse world to have received a memo that this game had released. But just think about it for a second. India and China combined are more than 2 billion out of the world's entire population. And when you add in most of the other countries, that's a lot of people who likely would have been either enthusiastic for, if not willing to spend on the game, that just weren't able to be involved in its launch. There you might of course say, but well, if they eventually get access to the game, it doesn't matter, right? In the end, everyone still gets to play the game, it just takes a little while to get there. Maybe this would have worked if this was like Senran Kagura or some other single player game where people could just wait for it and that isn't as much of an issue. But the fact that this was a competitive PvP game means that when people start to see numbers fall like this, Hell, even 3 months is a little too long to take to get these people into the game. Now, let us talk about the game itself, but when it comes to the game, I kind of want to look at it through the lens of what were Bandai's goals when they developed the game, because I feel like talking about whether or not the game itself was fun is something that is gonna be very subjective, because in the end, this game was designed with its core mechanics being very similar to a game that already exists, and some people would take this as something that is immediately negative, or some people will be thinking that this might be something that would give the game a springboard to further refine upon those systems and to make something very different. And the truth of the matter is that when we look at games historically, just because a game starts out similar to other games doesn't mean that it can't find its footing in the long term. League of Legends, when it first came out, was pretty much being called a Dota clone. The same could be said for Fortnite when it first came out. There are many games out there, hell, even the entirety of Cygames has been, for many years, built upon taking ideas that other people have had and refining those to a sheen and releasing it as a separate, different monetized mobile game instead. So when it comes specifically to saying that like, it's a clone, therefore it wouldn't work, it's like, well, hold off on that. We have seen companies that have been doing this successfully for a long time and that have done a pretty good job with it. So let's look at the goals of Bandai instead, because I feel like this will give us a better insight as to why they took the actions that they did, or perhaps why even the goals that they had set for the game might have been miscalculated, and why all of this might have led to them then taking actions or implementing systems that will cause even more disgruntlement with the way the game was being run. So first, let us look at what the design team had to say across all the interviews that they had given. He was saying that with this game, what they wanted to do was to create a game within the Gundam universe, which will be played outside of just Asia and Japan, because for those of you who didn't know, there's actually a competitive Gundam game that isn't an FPS that has been around for a very long time. It's the Mobile Suit Gundam Extreme V.s. series of games. They have been holding tournaments for this every year, but most of the players are within Asia, so in a sense, they are trying to say that aside from that series, they want to try to get a new breakout title that will be played by people across the world. Well, more specifically America and Europe, because in an attempt by the producer to show the world how little he knows about how big the world actually is, in a completely separate interview he then mentions that his main goal was to create a game with America also in mind. And then within the same interview, just a sentence later, he also then mentions that no, this game was created with both America and Europe in mind. So I don't know which it's meant to be, but it seems like this is very different from when he said in a separate interview that he wanted the game to be more worldwide instead, which might be why the game ended up excluding half of the world from its player base. The whole thing is a little messy, so it does feel a little odd the way he was phrasing it. But moving on from that, what else he also said within this interview is that through this game they also wanted to create a game that would appeal to Gundam fans while also pulling in the FPS fans. So when this was being mentioned in an interview, they were mentioning that the Gundam fans would come first and the FPS fans were kind of just being dragged into this along with it, because most of the other games before this were largely for the Gundam fans. It might have just been a bit of fan service the way he put it instead, but then when you look at what the other developers in the game are saying, they're saying that no, we kind of actually want to make a game that focuses on being a good FPS and then Gundam second. So even within the team across the multiple interviews they were involved in, there doesn't seem to be much consistency there. In their mind, it's probably more like 70% FPS, 30% Gundam instead. So there's a bit, as you can see, within even the management team, the developers' own minds, a conflict of what the objective of the game should be. But pretty much all of the decisions that they had made can be categorized into trying to appeal to one of two groups: the Gundam fans and the FPS fans. So first, let me talk to you Gundam fans out there, and the reason why we're doing this is because some of the points with regards to their attempts to appeal to the Gundam fans would also later on link to why this game might not have done as well with the FPS fans, and let's hope that these points would help me to build a good base from which we can explain why this game then did not appeal to the competitive FPS players who would probably have helped to skyrocket this game to even more popularity had it succeeded. So first off, to you Gundam fans out there, I want you to touch your heart and then touch your soul. I don't know where the soul is located, but I want you to touch them both and answer me this as honestly as you can. looking at the original 17 units released in the game, as well as the additional ones they added every season after, can you really say that this is a very good lineup? What I'm trying to get at is that with a game like this, there aren't gonna be as many characters being added. This is not gonna become something like an Extreme Versus where you have 225 characters in the most recent release. There's gonna be 6 released every year if the game had continued on this trend. And so you would really want to have the popular ones, the ones that people really enjoyed watching within the series, within the game, right? I mean, yes, Barbatos, IBO, everyone, I think at least, enjoy IBO quite a lot. Barbatos, quite well known. The RX-78 too, I mean, it's a classic. That one, if they didn't put it into the game, I think there would have been actual riots within Japan. Turn A, I mean, 20th anniversary, maybe not as popular with the modern viewers, but many people would still know of Turn A as well. And then you have what? The Dom Trooper from Gundam Seed Destiny? That's really cool. Where are Destiny and Freedom? I mean, come on. Destiny is in the title of the anime. You're gonna tell me that neither Destiny nor Freedom, which is one of the most popular Gundams from that series, are within the game, but this random Mook is? Why is the General Motors unit in this game? I'm pretty sure that's also a Mook from one of the older series. Why is the GM2 Sniper in this? This was literally a Mook from an OVA, not even a full series that was part of some other thing that wasn't actually that popular as well. Why could they not pick someone that was at least on the title or on the, you know, posters of the fucking thing? I don't understand. Then, like, why are there 2 Zakus as well? I mean, one should have been enough. It was picked to be a body count unit, just that many bad guys also used it, and hence it became something that was a bit more iconic. But even then, where you have a very limited number of units that can be in the game, you would want to pick things that, if you are trying to appeal to a specific fan base, the fan base would recognize. Even if you wanted something that would be in and maybe would only appeal to people who really follow the series quite a lot, you could have put in something that was still iconic in its own unique way. I don't know, put in the Malayan Gundam or something. It's horrible as well, but at least it would have been funny. Why put in multiple mooks that no one would have known? Well, we do know that what the reason most likely is. It's just that it's a very stupid reason is all, and this was something that was kind of hinted at some of the developer interviews as well, which is the fact that this game, in spite of the fact that it was meant to be designed to be a game for a certain IP's fans as well, was not designed cohesively with both the systems and the lore, but instead the systems were designed first, and then the characters from the lore were basically just blocks that were jammed into the right hole instead. You see, the thing with many of the games in the hero shooter subgenre is they kind of want you to know who you're shooting at and killing every time you fire your gun, especially in the chaos of a 5v5. And the reason for this is due to the fact that in these games, they have very specific roles and every character has very specific abilities. So they want their teams, the players, to be able to make very strategic decisions on who they want to focus down and who they want to run away like a little bitch from in the end. And when you look at a game like Overwatch, for example, it's kind of very obvious when you look at characters like Tracer, Mercy, and Roadhog. One of them looks like they're cosplaying everyone's favorite colorblind ninja, the other looks like Colonel Sanders' Grim Reaper, and the third one just looks like what everyone pictures an American to look like when they want to make fun of them. Fact of the matter, what is important is that they all look very distinct, and the reason this is being done is because in a 6v6 scenario where everyone's charging into each other, you kind of want to know who is who so that you can figure out who you want to target first as a team. And the thing with the Gundam series is that if you look at every single main character for every other Gundam series out there, arguably, if you were a fan of the series, you probably wouldn't have as much of an issue telling them apart because you would have a lot of time to have looked through all of this. But for FPS players who do not know what Gundam is or only have a vague understanding of what it is, having a team of 6 people looking like this, it's a lot harder for them to differentiate, especially if roles are gonna be a part of this game, which we'll get into a little later as well. So in order to make this game work out more in the sense that they are familiar with, they decided to just pick whatever mook they could find that had a more outstanding color as compared to the actual mainstay Gundams, which is why you had a character lineup that looked like this with 2 different Zakus for some reason. That and the top-down directive that the producer had kinda doesn't really make sense either when you really think about it. Like, the demographic they wanted to target were Gundam fans first, and shooter fans would get pulled into this, but really, when you think about Gundam as a series, it's a series with 43 years of history. If someone got into this series when they were 30, they would be 73 right now. You look at your granddad in his retirement home playing slots and poker every other day, would he honestly want to play this game? Especially, and this is another issue with the way this game was designed, is that due to the fact that it is designed very similarly to certain other FPS games out there are people who are going to come into this game with many, many years of experience already under their belt, some of them potentially even competitive players in that other game. You get your 73-year-old granddad who has no experience in FPSs, who maybe could still play Extreme Versus against the AI on his own, to now competitively work together with 5 other people whose reflexes might be better than him, against 6 other people whose reflexes are also probably better than him. He's probably gonna get bodied very hard, especially by the pro players within the game. So it doesn't really seem like something that they would enjoy as much, especially since there isn't any PvE content for them to enjoy. Because here's the thing, right? It's gonna take the matchmaking a while to figure out who the good and bad players are, since it has no data to work off at this single point in time. And the issue is that the very good players are people who might be coming in with years of experience, and the very bad players might be people in their 50s to 70s who have never played an FPS before in their lives. And with a game like this, it's a lot harder for them to try to learn on the go, because if they keep getting paired up with people who are way better at this game, they're just gonna get bodied really quickly, and there's not as much time for them to learn and adapt. With something like a Battle Royale, for example, or an TCG game, due to the fact that there's a lot more RNG involved in those, I mean, even for Battle Royale, since there is a very real chance that a pro player might even get accidentally ganked or just sniped out of nowhere without noticing once in a while. With games like those, there is a higher likelihood that you can learn more while playing the game, because the pro players will not have as oppressive of a presence. But when you're playing a highly paced FPS game where you have objectives to capture and everyone is screaming at each other to do their job right, it gets a little harder to pick things up when both teams have players that are basically gonna Thanos snap you into the Shadow Realm within seconds. So what I'm trying to say with this segment of the video is that in the end, even though this game was partially advertised as a game for Gundam fans, it feels like it did not do a good job targeting this audience of people, because really they weren't given a very complete Gundam experience. Hell, they only have 17 Gundams at the start compared to Extreme Versus' latest iteration in 2023 with its 225, and those, mind you, actually had more flair to them because of the fact that you also had the pilots within the game, the interactions that the different pilots in the animes have with the other pilots being a small part of the game as well. You can hear them scream as you pilot the mech and all that, but with this game you don't really get that. And on top of that, this game is essentially going to ensure that unless these people themselves are very skilled FPS players, they're probably gonna end up playing a game where they're just gonna get bullied half the time as well, especially when a much more casual experience with a much better variety of mechs already exists and has been competitive within Asia and Japan for quite a few years at least. Though speaking of matchmaking, let's talk about the FPS players as well, and how these people will be affected by the many decisions that were made by Bandai Namco in its attempt to run this game. In Japan, we had a separate launcher which was directly under Bandai instead, so all the numbers you see in terms of stats of players on the Steam charts actually does not include most of the Japanese players, because they don't typically play through Steam at least, and we didn't really have the matchmaking issues to as big of an extent as many people in Europe and America were complaining about. The issue here is that if you were not connected to the game when it closes, they would automatically just give you a timeout of about 5 minutes, meaning that if you were unfortunate enough to disconnect within the start of the match, when the game deems it still a point where they can just close it off completely and you can't rejoin in time, then sucks to be you're gonna get timed out, which would be fine if the game was stable. But the issue is that at the start of the game's release, because this is, especially for a company that has not had the competency to develop a competitive game on this scale before, and sure enough, there were quite a lot of complaints of people disconnecting simply just from opening the shop or from many other issues, which is a very big problem in trying to retain players when they're essentially getting punished for an issue with the game itself by not being able to. And the thing is, on top of that, it seems like many people were also complaining about there being a bug where after they disconnected, even though the match was still ongoing, they did not have the ability to just push a button to reconnect, and so they were just stuck there in the lobby until the match ended, and then they just got timed out instead, which issues like this, which essentially if the match goes on for a very long time, could cause the player to be punished and unable to play the game for a decently long period of time for an issue with the game. It can affect player retention quite a bit, And the thing is that from what I understand, at least watching videos made by people who played on these servers, this issue was fixed later on. It took quite a long while. And another issue, especially for casual matches, is the fact that the game doesn't have an autofill feature, kind of like Overwatch does. So if someone is removed from the match for whatever reason, there is no way for them to be replaced. Meaning that if the game somehow disconnects somebody and they can't reconnect because of the bugs of the game, you are then stuck in a 5v6 if the game chooses not to reset it. For something like that, really, it just feels like you end up in a situation where no one will be enjoying the game other than the people who just want a free win and to bully others. So the fact that this issue was left in for as long as it is probably added quite a bit to the player frustration, especially for FPS players and hero shooter players who already have alternative games they can easily go to when they realize that this game is just not being fixed. I don't know, it feels like nowadays, especially with very big companies, there's this impression that they can just release their games in a very piss poor state and then just slowly patch it back into being a proper game. Which, yeah, I guess when it comes to a single player experience, it may not affect them as bad because people can wait. They don't lose out as much from not being able to play the game, but with a game like this, with Gundam Evolutions, where it's a multiplayer PvP only game, just losing players to things like this is gonna result in a very big drop in the overall number of people playing the game. And as more people leave the game and numbers start to fall the way they do, less and less people are going to want to adopt the game because of the fact that they aren't gonna want to play a PvP game if there aren't enough people for them to VP with. And if the game that they're gonna test now with Gundam Evolutions is gonna constantly crash, they aren't gonna have enough time to understand the differences that this game wants to have and wants to show them. And as a result, they might just go back to whatever other game they came from or just hop to another game altogether. This brings us to the issue of monetization, because it really does feel like the people who designed this game really didn't understand all too well the spending habits of the people who they were trying to get to play this game in the first place when they designed these monetization systems. When it comes to microtransactions, it really does feel like the propensity to spend is much higher in Japan and Korea as compared to the rest of the West. So it feels like when they thought up most of this, they might have been looking at it too much from the perspective of would they spend rather than would the average player spend. And this spanned a wide range of products, starting with character skins and weapon skins to even unlocking the characters themselves, as well as purchasing from the gacha that's in-game. That said, for characters, you can also unlock it with the free currency, but what caused people to zoom in on this is the fact that you could also use the paid currency, and at the start of the game, it did not seem like there would be enough of the free currency possible for the players to gather to be able to unlock all 5. The in-game resource given to you at the start of the game, especially in the first season, was only really enough for you to unlock 2 out of the 5 characters. One character you could unlock after completing all the beginner challenges, which would take a few days, as well as from the battle pass. And due to the fact that the only real way you can get the resource is through grinding the battle pass, and the only way you can level up the battle pass effectively is through at least completing the dailies, if you don't at least do that, it means that your chances of getting a new character are gonna be as dead as the guy with the white hair at the end of IBO, as Olga always told us. The big issue here is the type of player behavior it rewards, as well as the type that it would then alienate. When you compare this to something else, any other competitive game, let's say Rainbow Six Siege or League of Legends, while they might be somewhat different, fact of the matter is those games do a more player-friendly job in trying to ensure that the free currency that is used to unlock characters can be easily gained by players in spite of how they might choose to play. And what I mean by this is that with the current system that exists in Gundam Evolutions, players who play in spurts are actually quite alienated by the current system as compared to those who play consistently. So obviously we know why they're doing this. It's kind of obvious that they want to ensure that they get a high DAU count, and so they have just cranked the rewards for logging in daily up to the nth degree, and in doing so hoping that their tactics will ensure that players would play daily instead. Some people just prefer to play the game in spurts, maybe to play for a week, stop playing for 2 weeks, come back a week after. Some people might be so busy they can't play on the weekdays, and so the weekend is the only real time that they can actually grind. And with games such as Rainbow Six Siege or League of Legends, the big difference is that they actually reward you with the currency after every game played. This is a very big difference from Gundam Evolutions, where you're only rewarded once you achieve certain levels in the battle pass, as if you do not achieve those levels, you get 0 of the currency. Granted, the first 1,000 is easier to achieve, But if you're the kind of player who can only achieve the first 1,000, that means that you're only able to unlock a new character once every 2.5 to 3 months instead. Granted, if you're to play some of the other games I mentioned, they do also have things like the first win of the day bonus, which do encourage players to play every day through giving them more of the resources for doing so. But at the same time, it does not completely alienate players who choose not to do so, as it still gives them a decent amount of a reward based off the length of each game played, instead of just telling them that you can't get anything at all. And so for people who end up getting alienated by such a system, they might actually see less value in playing the game and might have actually been driven away from the game instead. And the bigger issue at hand is that they didn't even let you at least try out the characters before purchasing them. You see, the thing is that, yeah, not all games do that either, but you would typically want to, especially if the investment is as big as playing for close to 2 months to unlock a character, to at least let the players test out the different characters and see if this is something that they would personally enjoy playing before they actually lock in their choice. Especially at the start of the game where the meta is largely unknown. So arguably, I would say it's not so much the game was pay to win, since your 2 unlocks, if you made it count, you could still win, per se. It's just that the game was paid to enjoy, because if you made the wrong choices, you couldn't really enjoy the game as much as you have wanted to. But the thing is, I can't even get all that mad at them for doing this, because this is a Japanese live service game you're talking about. Information obfuscation is part of their game, restricting the amount of information the players get and causing them to, as a result, make inefficient decisions that put them in situations where they need to wail, has been a part of the playbook for gacha and mobile games for years. And while the concept of it is scummy, the bigger issue at hand is that they chose to do this in a game and genre with which they were not familiar of the audience of, it would seem like. For PC gamers, particularly those who are very into competitive games, this is not as normal. With a mobile or gacha game, if you were to roll for the wrong character, you would set yourself back a bunch of months of resources that you cannot easily acquire again. Reason being that the only way you can get the resources is typically through attempting new content, which is also limited in most of those games, or through dailies or weeklies, and so the amount of the content you can get is always being gated. Whereas when you talk about games within a PvP setting, particularly on the PC, even if you made the wrong decision with the character that you picked, most of them reward you with more currency every time you play the game. So as long as you choose to continually play the game onward, you would still be able to get the character that you want within a short amount of time. You wouldn't have to wait for a few months for the resource to be slowly distributed to you. And that feels like one of the points that would have caused a cultural divide between what they tried to do based off what they thought the audience wanted and what the audience of the type of games that they were trying to attempt to make this time actually wanted. But credit where credit is due, they did in the end add in the ability for the player to test out the units they do not have in practice mode, and that is something that I feel they made a very good decision on. It's just that it does feel like this was a little bit too late. This ought to have been, in my opinion, something that was in the game from the start. That and the way they chose to do the monetization seems kinda questionable as well. If you manage to grind the battle pass all the way to the end, if you had spent on it, you would get back pretty much a full refund on your EC. And they also sell a pack at around 42 USD that allows you to acquire all of the 5 unlockable characters at the start of the game. Which basically, if you acquire that pack and you were to just like grind out the rest of the game, you would technically never have to spend on a single mech ever again. Which might seem like a very friendly thing for players because, yay, I don't have to spend money on this game after the first investment. But at the same time, this also means that their sources of monetization have become even more limited. Because on the one hand, they have already built a system where unless you're a paid player, you can't unlock all of the Gundams. But at the same time, if you make a single investment, you would basically acquire enough of the resource to have access and still be able to acquire every Gundam that comes down the road ad infinitum as long as you grind out well enough. So that's not a good source of monetization in the end. Granted, they have skins and the like as well. And I feel like the main goal was to make that the more important part of the monetization, which, yeah, I would say it's pretty average, it's fine. The prices, while they might look expensive, I mean like $80 for a 4 set sounds like it would be pretty bad, but when you think about it, It's really $20 on average for a skin, so between $13 to $20, and that's about what most big games are doing anyways. That said, the only issue with skins is that while it is profitable, it requires a large volume of players for it to be sustainable. If I recall, in its early days, Azure Lane, which is a gacha game with characters which tried to focus more on selling skins instead, and less on the gacha, was actually running in the red for quite a while until the player base got big enough. And this is due to the fact that with skins, once a person buys the skin, they're pretty much done unless there is another one they're gonna want to buy. It's very different from a character gacha where a person could just spend upwards of a few $100s rolling for a character who's gonna be outdated in a little bit, which arguably that system would definitely not work with a game like this. That would have been the nail in the coffin that would probably have killed it in like half the time. But yeah, quite frankly, I feel like if not for the character monetization system, the rest of it would have been fine and would have worked if they had managed to keep the DAU at a high enough level to begin with. Next up, on the point of communication. I know this sounds like a very simple thing, but the reason why I left it up to this point is because it is kind of linked to everything else we've talked about up to this point, which is that the communication that Bandai Namco had with its player base was quite frankly really lacking in my opinion. Really, if those people had a favorite card game, it would probably be Weiss Schwarz, because that way they can minimize the amount of interaction they have with anyone, that and while throwing anime IPs around, so kind of like what they do as well. Starting with the fact that they should have communicated better that most of the countries that were not included in the initial launch will be slowly added over time, and perhaps given a general schedule of when they had planned to at least add all of these countries in. Had they communicated better with the people from these countries, maybe giving them some form of reason as to why the game had not been added yet, and letting them know that it would be, and giving them a more concrete date, they might have been able to retain or salvage some of the hype that would have been lost within these countries, which in the end, if more people had been kept aware that they had the chance to be able to play this game in the future when it finally arrives, it might have resulted in a bigger impact on the DAU that would have supposedly increased when these countries were added, rather than it just moving barely like this. The same can be said with everything else I pointed out as well, the issues with the monetization, the fact that the servers weren't performing up to par, the fact that there was no way to use the practice mode to actually test out new units before they were released. They should have at least communicated to the players that they would have looked into it, and even if they couldn't fix it, they should have at least mentioned why. They could have put out a roadmap letting the players know when they would settle all of these issues by, when they would release the practice mode being usable for the units you do not have yet. You know, something like the roadmap that they released when the game's servers ended. I feel like something like that should have been done a lot earlier. Maybe it would have helped to keep the hype for the game more alive as well. And even if they could not fix some of it, for example, when it comes to monetization, I don't expect them to change it in the end, because while it might seem a lot more common sense from the player's perspective, like, yeah, this pricing is a little silly, the fact that you can only get 2 units is pretty horrible as well. Why not just change it to 3 or something, right? You still have 2 more you can monetize. Why not just give the players more of the resource? Though that has to do more with the way that microtransactions work in Japan. Like, legally, it's a lot harder for them to do something like this and not expect some form of rollback that would happen, meaning that they would take either a much bigger profitability hit, or they might actually see themselves being the target of a very big mass media campaign, which might eventually lead to even more issues with the government, which they would want to avoid. But that said, I feel like more open communication between them and the users would definitely have helped to retain users better, especially for a game that is in its first year of running. It feels like most of this would have been more important to ensure that they can maintain the DAU that they wanted. People play competitive online games for many different reasons, but in the end, one important thing that all of these competitive games need is a thriving community, something that can show the players that they are part of something bigger, and that can ensure that the gameplay is smooth, that the player can have a big variety of people that they can play with, interact with, maybe even make friends with, while not having to suffer from a queue that's gonna last 30 minutes just because there aren't enough unique players within the server for them to play against. When you consider the fact that the game was in development for a super long period of time, the amount of money they were probably earning from all of this feels like it probably just simply was not enough to cover the losses that they were facing. And looking at how low the DAU numbers would have likely have fallen to at that point, you can understand that with a company like Bandai, when they release this game, it does feel like something that they released with the intention of this being the next big hit, and not something that will fall into 10-year-old obscure MMO tier of DAU after just 1 year of service. So it really does feel like they quite likely just saw that the writing was on the wall, that they would never be making back all of the money they had sunk into this. Not without another huge investment into revamping the game and into marketing all over again, but Bandai Namco being the type of company they are, I can imagine that they would have just decided that the best course of action then would just be to cut it all short. Especially since looking at the team that was working on the game, they probably wouldn't, in my opinion at least, be the type of team that would be able to fix the rut that this game had fallen into within its first year. But yeah, I feel like if you look at just the core mechanics and systems that comprise this game, it wasn't all too bad of a game. And before you say like, this guy just doesn't know good games. Now listen to me, I know bad games, okay? I have played some of the worst, the lowest rated games in Japanese history. I play them just for the shits and giggles of it. I live in the filth. I know what shit is. This is not shit. This was a game that had potential to have its own niche within the whole competitive FPS genre itself. Because between the fact that this game was trying to deconstruct the way roles worked and all this kind of FPS games with their own unique characters with different skills, and the fact that the game actually had a rather unique, somewhat melee-ish focus to it as well, kind of felt like it could have given it a unique niche. And with the fact that Overwatch 2 was doing as abysmally as it was, this game actually felt like if it was treated better, that it could potentially have actually occupied that space and at least taken away some of the player base from Overwatch 2. And so, if you ask me, it feels like, yeah, this game, it did have a lot of potential to have been a lot more. It just, with the way this game was designed and all the issues and troubles with it, it kind of feels like this game just ended up, even though it had so much potential going for it at first, being designed with no one truly in mind, because it tried to balance two very different groups of people without fully understanding what each of these groups are really about, especially on a global scene. As someone who has worked in the Japanese game industry for quite a few years now, I really just feel like a large part of this might also just be due to the fact that a lot of these large companies are just slowly becoming more and more disconnected from what it means to actually develop a game. The thing with this, and this might not be as common outside of Japan, so many people may not know this, but a lot of large companies like your Bandai Namco, your Konamis, they do actually outsource some parts, or in certain titles, a large part of the game's development to other companies like Shift, like Lancers, like companies whose entire goal is simply to just help other companies develop games, and they typically don't tend to show up on the surface because they're just basically outsourcing people to these bigger companies. And so when they actually try to develop titles within the company itself, they tend to stumble a lot more, because it really just feels like they no longer have as much of a competency when it comes to developing titles of their own. I mean, you look at the team that was tasked with developing this game, you have a person at the top who really doesn't have a very good track record, who feels like he's just there due to the fact that he has been in the company for a long time working on Gundam stuff. You have a team of designers who have had no experience developing games. Like, why was the entire team stocked with people like this? Where are the veterans who were supposed to help ensure that this very huge title, which was supposed to become a global hit, would be in the team and who would be the ones who are giving interviews? Why was it given to fresh hirees? The fact that the game took 6 years to develop as well really felt like it did quite a number on the game's ability to succeed. Back before a free-to-play version of Overwatch existed, it feels like it could have been the Fortnite to Overwatch's PUBG, and given the time, the game would have had to develop its own niche and find its own footing while not having to deal with as exorbitant of a design cost. It feels like it might have had more of a chance to succeed, but it does feel like a lot of the issues with the Japanese game industry that have been plaguing it for quite a while are also showing themselves within the way that this game's development took place. But yeah, that's all I really have to say for this video. Thank you all for watching to this point. Hopefully it was interesting. Hopefully you guys managed to glean some interesting information out of this. I dug a lot more into the Japanese side in terms of the information, so some of this may not hopefully be as well known outside of Japan, so maybe I got to at least share something interesting with you guys. I really don't know. Personally, the fact that this game didn't do well is kind of sad to me as someone who does follow the GGGP, which is the Extreme versus tournament. So yeah, I think the rest of the videos this month are likely gonna be on other game industry related topics that I'm just interested in talking about. Maybe one or two on events if I can find events to go to. Either way, the schedule will be on Discord. So if you want to figure out what I'm doing for videos or streams, you can find it there. This month is the last month that I'm gonna be unemployed temporarily. I hope. So I may make less videos after that happens because I need to deal with work as well. But either way, it will still be at least 2 videos per month, and that will be all up on the schedule on Discord. So the Discord link is down below. You can join that if you want. If you found this video interesting, do feel free to subscribe or like if you want to support me doing more of this in the future. That said, I'll be heading off for now. Take care and bye bye.